In this video, I want to explain the state of VR and where we really are right now, and provide context to explain why it makes sense that we are where we are by showing the driving forces behind the VR market and the part VR is actually playing in one company's long game that impacts the entire market. To do this, we need a big picture view. So I'll be bouncing between details and a 10,000-foot view of everything. Let's start with PC VR. Setting the stage, it's spring 2016. Expectations for VR are through the ceiling. There's a rush of activity and a race to get to market. At the gunshot, the Oculus Rift is there out the gate before its hand controllers are even ready. The complete HTC Vive system is released 1 week later. Supporting these new systems, Oculus has their own game store and Vive has Steam. When the Rift hand controls were released later in December, they were very ergonomic compared to the large Vive wands. The Vive tracking was better, but critically, the Rift's cameras were good enough. I owned one, it worked well. The Rift CV1 was discounted quickly to about $400, undercutting Vive's price while being more comfortable and performing better because of their superior reprojection at the time. So, market share, Oculus. Some companies expected VR to be huge right out the gate, and they gambled a lot of money to be there in time. CCP spent $30 million to create Valkyrie, a AAA space combat game including voiceovers from Katie Sackhoff, if you're a Battlestar Galactica fan. They'd been working on it for years in anticipation of consumer VR. It ran on 3 standards, so it had Oculus, Steam VR, and Sony PlayStation VR. In September 2017, just 18 months after the Rift and Vive were released, CCP disbanded their entire development team. Let me just say that I loved Valkyrie, but that doesn't matter. It wasn't profitable. And this was an early sign AAA VR games were just not profitable. The next 2 milestones are the center of PC VR evolution and many heated debates on the forum. In 2017, the second milestone was Microsoft licensing Windows Mixed Reality. Microsoft was the first to release an inside-out tracking system. They paid for all the R&D, licensed the new Windows Mixed Reality standard along with the supporting hardware and hand controllers. They built support for Windows Mixed Reality directly into Windows. They had a game store. All the building blocks looked like they were in place. Now, maybe because of products like the Zune and Windows Phone, Microsoft never released their own VR headset and left this to other manufacturers. However, they made it very easy for manufacturers to enter VR space relatively cheaply and focus on the headset display's optics and ergonomics. The fact this was easy is obvious from all the companies who suddenly had VR headsets ready to drop right around Christmas of 2017. Overnight, PC VR went from 2 to 3 standards and from 2 to 8 headsets. Kind of a big jump. Unfortunately, the Windows Mixed Reality hand controller hardware was clunky. The tracking was not as good as the tracking of the Rift or Vive. For many VR users, the hand controllers and tracking were simply not good enough. And the Windows Mixed Reality portal added another layer that users learned to bypass for performance reasons. People continued to go to the Steam store for games, and the Microsoft store didn't grow. Windows Mixed Reality headset manufacturers entered the market heavily discounted. They had to compete with Oculus Rift's Black Friday sale for $350, and most headsets were very quickly discontinued. But I need an asterisk here. It's important to mention that Windows Mixed Reality headsets actually worked well for the niche of VR enthusiasts who are into racing and flight simulators. Because they were seated and didn't use the hand controllers, many considered the tracking just fine. Of all the mixed reality headsets, the Samsung Odyssey rose to the top early on, and later on the HP Reverb G1 and G2 had a following because of the relatively low price and high resolution. if Microsoft had continued development on the inside-out tracking and the hand controller hardware, they likely would have done much better. But Microsoft didn't have a long game for VR and didn't put much effort into it after it was launched. The next milestone is from Valve. They'd been working with HTC earlier, but my take is that they were frustrated with the results and decided to show how it should be done. The next milestone happened with the release of the Valve Index. I had a Valve Index and enjoyed it for 4 years. It has been the most popular PC VR headset for a while, but it was the release of the 2.0 base stations and the hand controllers that were the game changers for the enthusiast market. So they had the best tracking, excellent hand controllers, a well-established store, and most importantly, like Windows VR, they licensed this technology to other headset manufacturers to make it easy for those companies to get into VR. So they could concentrate on evolving the headset technology. We already had tracking, the handsets work great, why waste time there? As a result, many enthusiast headsets have been created and continue to be released using Valve's base station tracking and hand controllers. I've personally used my base stations and hand controllers with 3 completely different headsets so far. This has been a huge success for PC VR. Unfortunately, Windows Mixed Reality's entry and then exit from this market, combined with the quality of Meta's inside-out tracking and an inexpensive product, created unrealistic expectations about how easily inside-out tracking could be implemented. And because Microsoft didn't continue to develop Windows Mixed Reality, having a standard for inside-out tracking died on the vine and has now become a rare exception except on Meta headsets. So while many of us were debating tracking systems, enjoying PC VR, etc., Oculus was heading in a different direction, very quickly and deliberately. In May of 2018, the Oculus Go was released. It was pretty wimpy. It had no tracking, but it was VR that didn't require a PC. And it was cheap. Got right in there, people could play. Following year later, February 2019, less than 2 years after the CV1 was released, the Rift S comes out at $399. It had inside-out tracking. It was still PC VR, but the inside-out tracking was usable for most people, and it had well-designed hand controllers. It did well. Then, just 3 months later, the cord was cut, and standalone VR gaming with inside-out tracking was here. It started at only $299. No expensive PC necessary to experience real VR gaming. Ruh-roh. Sure, the games had lower polygon counts, but they had a new lightweight VR gaming SDK and an efficient engine. Well, many VR enthusiasts looked at each other and dismissed the Quest as, it's the wrong direction. It wasn't what we wanted. I was in that boat. I completely dismissed the Quest when it came out. But since then, VR hasn't gone the way many of us expected it would have. Let me make a quick side note. The Sony PlayStation VR didn't really catch on. Despite selling a lot of headsets, the VR console gaming didn't flourish. VR headset sales were well below predictions. Notice Microsoft never offered VR for the Xbox. In fact, the Sony PlayStation VR 2 headsets are now being sold to be used with PCs to help get rid of inventory. Enough said. So, many PC VR enthusiasts have felt like VR is just taking forever to advance. In the PC VR space, games were not coming, headsets were getting more expensive, GPUs were getting more expensive. We had crypto mining, supply shortages, and irritatingly, Meta had sold far more standalone headsets than all the PC VR headsets combined. Uh-oh. So Meta now owns the low end of the PC VR market and most of the VR market. Why? They have a massive research and development budget. Because of that, they have far better inside-out tracking than anyone else has. But they have no interest in licensing it as a standard like Microsoft or Valve did. They also have developed excellent optics like the pancake lenses people with Quest Pros and Quest 3s can attest to. And they're also selling at a loss to this day. That's with huge manufacturing economies of scale compared to any other VR headset manufacturer. The Quest was released at $299. The Quest 2 was released at $299. They just put out a Quest 3S at $299. So they've made entry into VR cheap. Now, the Quest 3 is estimated to cost Meta $474 just to build it. And they sell it for $499 retail. That can't break even. They put in a huge R&D effort to get those pancake lenses where they are, and everything else that goes into that headset, $499 is delivered. So Meta's now lost over $50 billion pursuing VR, metaverse, and related technology. Meta sets unrealistic expectations for many people. When you compare a headset created with a massive R&D budget, manufactured with larger economies of scale than anyone else, so the price per unit volume, it's lower, and then on top of all of that, they sell it at a loss? This leaves people asking why another headset costs so much more, and why doesn't it have inside-out tracking, and why doesn't it have the optics of the Quest 3? Or worse, people assume that some companies like Valve could sell a new headset at a loss and make that loss up in software sales. We'll see that isn't remotely possible and is absolutely not what Meta's doing either. So, if Meta dominates the low end with subsidized bang for the buck, where do the competitors go? They have no choice. Upmarket. It's the only place they can go. They have to have enough features beyond what is being mass-produced to justify the additional cost. And that's why we continue to see new enthusiast headsets in the $1,000 to $4,000 range using Steam VR tracking. So, did something go wrong? Or is it possible everything's okay? Or at least maybe as it should be? It definitely could have gone in different directions. Despite the chasm forming between the lower and higher end, VR technology has continued to advance and some good things happened. Display resolution has increased from pancakes with massive screen door effect, where you could see between the pixels very clearly, to having near retina resolution. We've had many different types of displays, improving resolution, contrast with deeper blacks, increased display brightness, as well as improved color gamuts. And we've had better lenses with less distortion, sharper edge-to-edge clarity, and wider field of view developed. What else has gone right? For PC VR, we've had more powerful GPUs. They've increased to 261% of what they had in 2016. We've had the PC VR standards kind of consolidating. Windows Mixed Reality is gone. Oculus has ported everything to use OpenXR in terms of PC VR games. Steam VR and OpenXR is transitioning to OpenXR. So it looks like OpenXR is going to be the standard to come. Software has also matured and advanced to support VR better. Gaming engines improved VR software efficiency. Some games that were single core limited are now supporting multiple CPU cores with dedicated cores for VR rendering. NVIDIA drivers improved, sometimes with a single driver update. They also introduced things like deep learning super sampling, so you could send less resolution down the pipe and have it upscaled at the GPU and have it be faster for more performance. And on the non-PC VR side of things, Meta's standalone software standard that doesn't require PC is still highly efficient. The Qualcomm Snapdragon chips powering them continue to increase by jumps. And overall, technology in many areas has continued to advance at a pretty good clip. But it seems like most enthusiasts in VR are always wanting more and never happy. We want more for less. And despite there being very little economy of scale in VR, we want very different things and ignore other people in VR who want very different things. So not a lot of empathy in VR, it seems. Lots of knockdown, drag-out fights over what I want for me, and who cares about what you want? That's stupid, right? I've seen it. This brings me to the current state of VR, which was kind of the focal point of this entire video. If I were to sum up the state of VR in a single word, just one word, it'd be fragmented. It's fragmented by what it's used for. It's fragmented by different hardware standards. It's fragmented by the accessories people use with it. It's fragmented by different software standards. It's fragmented by different price points. And it's extremely fragmented by the driving forces behind the manufacturers making products for it. Let me start by talking about fragmentation among use cases with three very different use cases for VR. Now, I realize that many people cross between these three use cases. I know I do. But I think it's important to look at how different they are and how different the needs of the different enthusiasts are. First up are the room scale gamers. These people, they need a game controller or hand controllers. Sometimes they want a microphone so they can talk. With these hand controllers, playing things like first point of view shooters and so forth, they need decent to excellent tracking and reasonably light and comfortable headsets so they can move around quickly. There are many people who are playing made-for-VR games like Beat Saber, Asgard's Wrath, Half-Life Alyx, various VR esports, and there are many games that have been added to the VR support roster through mods like Cyberpunk 2077, and some of them still use game controllers, but there's actually a pretty good amount of titles out there that can be played or have been modded to play. But the biggest complaint by many gamers is that there are not enough made-for-VR games. And they believe that if we had more of these games, it would be more popular. Maybe some, but not enough to be profitable. Then there are the social VR people. Social VR titles like VR Chat generally give people the ability to create environments, customize what their avatars look like and what they sound like. And since this is all about socializing with other people, it has infinite replayability, which is kind of a step up over the gaming market because their mind is the limit of what they can create in these environments, and they're just having fun hanging out with friends. So they consider, if they're only into the social aspect, VR is just a place to hang out with virtual friends, create spaces to visit, schedule events like dance parties. And from a hardware standpoint, social VR enthusiasts have some additional requirements compared to gamers. In an effort to make avatars as fully expressive as possible and that move naturally, they want eye tracking so that the gaze of the avatar's eyes follows where they're looking. They would like to have face tracking to show more expressions. They want a good microphone, obviously, to talk to others. And they want full body tracking past the headset. They want to be able to move around and look like a naturally moving whatever, humanoid being, furry, whatever there are in that. But generally this makes having very good tracking a big deal. And historically, base station tracking and Vive trackers have been the gold standard. But there are improving slime trackers with more advanced software that can help create a more natural looking, realistic arm-leg movement. And they're coming along, so it's not going to be limited just to base stations. That's still probably the best by a small margin, but the other stuff is catching up. Last, we have the simulation people. Obviously, I fit in that category. These VR users have a very different set of needs. Frequently, they don't need hand controllers. unless they play room scale games like I do. And all they need is a VR headset and decent tracking. And since they're seated in VR, there's less concern about headset weight by many. They also want eye tracking, but not in order to have a gaze of an avatar. They need dynamic foveated rendering for performance purposes because some of these sim titles are extremely CPU and GPU intensive. Now, some like to have a good microphone for player versus player combat or to communicate with teammates in a race. Some even want pass-through video to show hands interacting with controls. So they've got, mostly I would say in flight games where there's a pile of controls. Not that I don't have many on here, I just memorize where they are. But people want to see themselves interact with these controls. And so pass-through cameras, it's another way to go more upscale. One important point is while the sim community is just one enthusiast market, they have a large pocket of whales. People with deep pockets and who can afford to buy higher end VR gear. And that's why many of the low volume, top end enthusiast headsets seem to cater to the sim community. Now, each of these three types of users has a very different set of needs based on what they use VR for. And they don't always agree on the direction other companies are going in, which is why it's good there's a diverse number of headset manufacturers making products that cater to different markets. Whether you want something that's ultra small or ultra wide field of view or whatever your priority is for the current level of technology, there is likely some company that's trying to cater to that. So let's step back again and let's look at gaming software revenue. Gaming software in general has had strong growth in the last few years. It's currently around $200 billion a year. Now, of that big pie of $200 billion, software for arcades and dedicated handheld gaming devices it's really shriveling up fast. Gaming consoles are still strong, but basically flat. PC and mobile games on average, they're having decent high single-digit growth year over year. And VR gaming software actually has the largest percentage of growth year over year, but it's still a tiny percentage of the overall gaming market at 2.5%. So let's look at that 2.5% of VR revenue slice a little closer. It's estimated to be about $4.3 billion. That's the estimate for 2024 for all VR headsets. So that's Meta's standalone games, Sony PlayStation games, PC VR games. Now let's put this in the context of how many of these headsets are out there. The Quest 2 and Quest 3 combined are about 55% of Steam VR totals. If you look at their listings, they're always at the top. It's estimated that 20% of these Quest 2s and 3s are connected to PCs. So completely forgetting about the Sony PlayStation VR games, that would mean, ideally, that about a third of the 2.5% is for PC VR, or only 0.8% of the market. So if you're a PC VR user wondering why you haven't seen dedicated AAA VR titles coming to PC VR, that's why. You make a lot more money making a simple mobile phone game. But Beat Saber, you say? Well, yeah, two guys did pretty well with that. And of course, sold it to Meta. That leads me to the next question. Why would a company ever invest money into VR games? There are a few reasons. Most AAA games were created for or paid for by hardware vendors. Meta created Robo Recall. They paid Codemaster to create VR support for Dirt Rally 1. They ported standalone versions of many titles for the Quest in 2019. Valve launched Half-Life Alyx to go with the Valve Index in March 2020. Similarly, Microsoft added VR support to Microsoft Flight Simulator, ostensibly for Windows Mixed Reality, but for all headsets. And Sony, of course, wanted PlayStation titles for their users to play. Another really small, short-lived group are the ones who wanted to cash in by being early to market. Now, the one huge early example I already mentioned, CPP, they created that VR-only AAA game, Valkyrie, and spent tens of millions, lost their shirt, and dismantled their VR team. There were much smaller groups that did similar things, where they built a product thinking it would come. They looked at what happened with mobile phones, and they're thinking, oh yeah, we'll build this little thing. It's early in the VR cycle, we'll sell a lot. It never happened. At the other end of the spectrum, some companies were paid to add VR support, and it was no gamble at all. Eagle Dynamics, with their digital combat systems, added VR support because they were commercial applications for flight training, military flight training. They also implemented quad view dynamic foveated rendering for the same reason. They were paid, and it was used for military flight training. Similarly, Codemasters was paid by Oculus to give Dirt Rally 1.0 VR support in the early days. So some people didn't lose their shirt. They were paid, and they got it out there. In the sim community, there was another group. We had companies that invested early, like iRacing, and a couple were paid to add VR support, but most of the others, they seemed to be dragged into it by the no VR, no buy movement by a number of people who wanted VR sim titles. And it seemed to work. They were a very vocal group, got some backlash for the rest of the community who didn't care about VR, but it worked. Okay, so what we've seen is there's not a lot of money in the VR hardware. There's not a lot of money to be made in the VR software. So let's look at what drives the companies that were making VR hardware. And this is a big picture view. I'm not doing a deep dive into every company making headsets right now. I'm trying to hit the key points of this. So VR has not grown by leaps and bounds and only accounts for 2.5% of gaming software revenue. Valve's monthly hardware statistics show the number of gamers using VR each month is dropped below 2% of their total gamers. There was a brief blip after COVID. This heavily impacts the resources that people are going to spend for VR's sake alone. Valve is not nearly as large as Meta or Microsoft, but Valve has tried very hard to make VR a success. They worked early on with HTC, and then they released an excellent headset of their own, and it sold well. They showed what a AAA room-scale game could be with Half-Life Alyx. Most importantly, they licensed a standard that's been used by many manufacturers to continue in PC VR. That is their legacy. The numerous enthusiast headsets with many different priorities being released licensing this standard, whether they're the ultra small or large or whatever. Now, whether we see a new Valve headset anytime in the future, who knows? The next hardware manufacturer I want to talk about is the entire category of a Windows mixed reality. I know it's dead, but this is equally important. Microsoft didn't have a long game or a plan for VR, and they didn't fully commit to this effort. Moreover, they cut off development for it early on, and they supported it mostly by just not pulling it out of Windows. Now, that required maintenance, and they did finally cut it off, but that's about the extent of their support for it for the last few years. If they had advanced the inside-out tracking and the hand controllers, there would have been more headsets created to use that standard, and I'm sure many in this market would have appreciated that. However, then they would be losing money year after year like Meta, and since they didn't have a long-term plan, it made no sense for them to stay. So what is Meta up to? They're the only titan left in the VR market. It should be obvious that if they wanted to, they could own the high end of the VR market as well. It's simply too small for them to care about. If VR really isn't profitable, especially with the R&D they're pouring in, and the price points they're selling their hardware at, and with the small tail-end profits from the software sold, why on earth would they drop over $50 billion into this market? It's a lot of money. You can be sure they expect to make their money back, too. Meta's efforts to date include being the first to enter the VR market through their acquisition of Oculus, creating a standalone VR device without tracking, then the first good inside-out tracking PC VR headset, then a completely standalone VR headset with inside-out tracking. They added eye tracking, face tracking, pass-through cameras. They've shown off internal R&D for hand tracking and other useful technology over the years. Then on the software side, Meta's purchased companies creating successful VR titles like Lone Echo, Beat Saber, and Asgard's Wrath. But they didn't buy them to make a profit in VR. So why then? Let's be blunt. VR is barely growing. It's far better at losing money than making money. And there's absolutely no reason to lose $50 billion on VR unless you have another objective that will pay off. Let me also mention that both Apple and Samsung have shown an interest in the exact same long game, in the exact same market, and they're putting all the same building blocks together. So, remember that $200 billion a year in the gaming market? Half of that, $200 billion, is for lightweight video games that run on your smartphone. Well, didn't Meta just convert many large VR titles over to run on their lightweight standalone SDK? Someday, might it be good to have an army of the best VR developers who can create lightweight mobile types of applications? So, let's add to this that the smartphone market is right now just below $500 billion a year. I'm sure many of you have seen the recent unveiling of Meta's Orion augmented reality glasses. No surprise that it uses much of the same technology that Meta's released for use in VR. Standalone internal processing, inside-out tracking, eye tracking, highly efficient, lightweight SDK, and they have a development house to support it. Augmented reality will totally eclipse virtual reality. And all Meta needs is a fraction of that market to reclaim all the money they've been spending on this. If you compare $50 billion against $100 billion a year in mobile games, $479 billion a year in smartphones, and that's still a growing market. So let's take a peek at these. We've got a number of companies with an eye on the prize and one that completely missed it. So you can see Meta. They showed their Orion glasses. They have a lightweight VR SDK. They have an army of developers that can use that SDK, and they have a game store. Then you've got Apple. Apple came out with the Apple Vision Pro, and it's compatible with lightweight mobile SDK products that were made for the iPhone. And they have an army of developers. Then Samsung, they've got something in development. It's compatible with Google Android, and that's a lightweight SDK. They have an army of developers, and they've got the Android store. And then you've got Microsoft. They've got the HoloLens. Microsoft phone pretty much died. Well, I mean, it did. And their games are basically for Windows and bulky. They don't have any of the building blocks in place for the AR market right now, not in any real sense. Augmented reality will be an absolutely huge market. And just in case it isn't obvious, augmented reality glasses are the long game. And everything leading up to this was to develop the building blocks necessary to make those. But AR is not soup yet. This is still a long game that will play out for many years. So why did Meta even show off their internal development augmented reality glasses? Could it be related to the Apple Vision Pro that was released recently? Maybe somebody wanted to elbow Apple and say, this is what it's supposed to look like. Now, Apple released the Apple Vision Pro to the public too early. It should have been for developers only to work on the apps and interface, everything necessary for the eventual real augmented reality device. The AVP is not augmented reality. It's mixed reality with pass-through cameras. It's bulky and most people would never wear it all day. However, every way that you interact with the AVP would also work with augmented reality. That makes it a perfect test bench. So, let's be clear how important it was when Apple released the AVP. People noticed. Samsung and Meta both immediately announced an answer to this product. They were worried that Apple knew something they didn't and they misjudged the market. However, when it became clear the AVP, while cool, wasn't a product that was going to sell in volume, Samsung and Meta both killed their rushed mixed reality spatial computing projects because they considered the AVP a failure. Orion is not nearly ready for prime time, but it is an approximate shape of what is to come. In hindsight, it seems obvious this was their long-term game all along. However, I'm not suggesting Meta didn't want VR to be more of a success than it's been. But it had to have been pretty obvious that VR was not going to pay off except as a stepping stone pretty early on. And think about this. They acquired Oculus in 2014. This is a very long-term investment. They've been at it for 10 years and they still haven't come out the other side. They're still pouring money into it. Apple and Samsung are not out of this race. Meta showed where they're heading, and they'll be working hard to get augmented reality glasses to market first. But the first to market isn't always the one that wins long term. But even within that, if Meta even manages to get a piece of the augmented reality pie, they'll have gotten a great return on their investment. So this makes sense. Even as big as it is, the market for AR is going to be absolutely huge. It will rival the smartphone market. Now, let's come back to VR. Well, what do you think the future is? The Titans have already decided VR is small potatoes, really not worth their effort. However, this isn't doom and gloom. VR does not need to be a dominant market or larger than augmented reality to be successful in the future. VR will keep its enthusiasts for certain use cases, and the technologies will continue to develop. If anything, when AR finally does hit in a big way, it will drive the development of shared technologies much faster, and VR will get a big boost just from pulling the maturing technologies developed for augmented reality. And personally, while I think that social VR and sim people will get the most out of VR in the short term, I think the gamers may be pleasantly surprised. When AR takes off and massive numbers of VR or AR games are being made, it should be very easy for them to be ported to VR. It may be a ways off, but it's very, very highly possible. My hope is that this video helps people understand why certain confusing things continue to happen in VR and put context around it and give people more realistic expectations of why we don't have certain things right now. I'm also expecting the comments section to be interesting, so see you there.